Picture a courtroom in Perth, February 2013. A woman walks to the witness stand. She sits down. She looks straight ahead. She is not a police officer, not a forensic expert, not a rival gang member with a score to settle. She is a mother, and the man she is about to give evidence against is her own son, the most feared bikie in Western Australia, a man who had survived a basement stabbing and shooting in 2005 and walked out of hospital. A man who had orchestrated a firebombing that destroyed $500,000 worth of motorcycles in a single night. A man whose name had terrorized an entire outlaw motorcycle club into silence for years. She had raised him. She had watched him grow. She had every natural human reason to protect him, the way every mother instinctively protects her child. Instead, she confirmed under oath that she had seen him strike the mother of his own grandchildren with her own eyes. That testimony changed everything, and it is the most important moment in Troy Mercanti's entire criminal history. More than the basement shooting, more than the firebombings, more than the 2024 sexual assault charges that collapsed under circumstances that troubled prosecutors and advocates alike. Because it is the moment one woman's choice to tell the truth cost her everything a mother fears losing. Hit subscribe now, because this story is not about Troy Mercanti. It is about the two women who finally made him answerable, and one of them was his own mum. To understand what it cost that woman to sit in that witness stand, you need to understand exactly who her son was by February 2013. Troy Desmond Mercanti was born in Perth in 1967, into a family whose story reads like a classic post-war migrant success narrative. His father Michael arrived from Italy in 1952 and built a single shoe repair kiosk in Perth's Dianella Plaza into a multi-million-dollar retail and wholesale operation across the city. Troy had a stable family, a successful business waiting for him, and every practical reason to choose an ordinary, comfortable life. He walked away from all of it in his early 20s and joined the Coffin Cheaters instead. By the time his mother walked into that Perth courtroom in 2013, her son had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation most Western Australians would recognise on sight. He had survived a basement knife and gunfight at the Metro nightclub in Northbridge in January 2005 that put 2 men in hospital. He had orchestrated a bikie war so destructive it produced firebombings, an interstate shooting at a Sydney peace meeting, and ultimately, a public brawl at a Perth motorsport event in front of families who had come to watch drag racing. A brawl in which one man had 3 fingers severed and another was shot in the leg. He had been expelled from his own club in February 2008 in a deliberately humiliating ceremony, lured to a property near the Moore River under the pretense of a celebration, then beaten and stripped of his patches by his own brothers. And rather than withdraw, he had helped found a rival Perth chapter almost immediately, bringing with him a decade of organisational knowledge and loyal associates, turning his expulsion into an act of open warfare. He had refused to cooperate with an Australian Crime Commission examiner rather than answer questions under oath, earning himself an additional 12 months in prison. He was by every external measure one of the most dangerous and volatile figures in the history of Western Australia's outlaw motorcycle scene. And his mother knew all of it. She knew every headline, every charge, every acquittal. Every night he had not come home, and she walked into that courtroom anyway. Before we get to the mother, you need to understand the woman who gave her the opening. Tammy Kingdom had spent 15 years as Mercanti's partner and the mother of his 2 sons. By her own sworn testimony, those 15 years had been marked from a relatively early point by control, intimidation, and physical violence that grew progressively more severe as Mercanti's drug and alcohol use worsened over time. She stayed, she said, largely for the sake of their children. She visited him twice weekly during one of his earlier prison terms. She held together a family unit under circumstances that from the outside are almost impossible to fully imagine. The incident that became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case happened around Christmas 2006. Mercanti had been gone for several days. When he came home, Kingdom told the court he showed clear signs of intoxication and extended sleep deprivation. According to her evidence, once inside their bedroom, he assaulted her with repeated punches to her head and body, then followed her into the bathroom to continue the attack when she attempted to get away from him. Later that same day, at a family gathering, he struck her again in front of relatives. That assault knocked out one of her teeth entirely and loosened two others. Police investigating the historical pattern of violence she described obtained her medical records specifically to cross-reference documented hospital visits against the timeline of incidents she was describing to the court, building an evidentiary picture that extended well beyond one person's word against another's. Mercanti's defense team argued her injuries had resulted from intoxication or accidental causes rather than deliberate assault, a common defensive strategy in domestic violence cases. Considerably harder to sustain when medical documentation exists alongside a detailed dated account of specific incidents. But it was not the medical records that finished the defense. It was what happened next. Mercanti's own mother was called to give evidence. She told the court she had personally witnessed her son strike Tammy Kingdom during the same Christmas Day incident Kingdom herself had described. She had been at the family gathering. She had seen it with her own eyes. It is difficult to overstate how significant that specific piece of testimony was to the case's outcome. This was not a hostile witness, not a rival gang associate with an obvious motive to damage Mercanti's credibility, not even simply a neutral bystander who happened to be passing. It was his mother, a woman with every natural incentive to protect her son, the way parents almost instinctively do, regardless of what they know, regardless of what they have seen, regardless of what it costs everyone else. She was presumably called by the prosecution specifically because there was no more credible or difficult to dismiss witness available. A defense lawyer cannot cross-examine a mother's love out of existence. They cannot suggest she had a motive to lie. They cannot argue she misremembered, because she was there, at a family gathering, watching her son strike the woman raising his children, and she remembered exactly what she had seen. What does it cost a mother to sit in that chair, to look across a courtroom at her own son, not across a kitchen table, not across a phone call, not in the privacy of a car where difficult things get said and then softened, but in a formal court of law, under oath, in front of a judge, in front of lawyers, in front of strangers, and confirm that what the prosecution was saying about him was true? We do not know what conversations happened before that day. We do not know what she said to him in private. We do not know whether she gave him the chance to plead guilty before she was called, and whether he refused. What we know is what she did when the moment arrived. She did not protect him. She protected the truth. 2 weeks into the trial, having maintained his innocence up to that point, Mercanti abandoned his defense entirely. He entered guilty pleas to 3 counts of assault and 1 count of causing grievous bodily harm. A man who had faced an Australian Crime Commission examiner and refused to say a single word. A man who had walked out of a basement in Northbridge, bleeding from stab wounds, and still managed to survive the legal aftermath. A man whose entire reputation had been built on never backing down, folded after his own mother confirmed under oath what he had done. The defense was not beaten by police. It was not beaten by forensic evidence. It was beaten by a woman who loved her son, and loved the truth more. In March 2013, District Court Judge Simon Stone handed down his sentence. 6 years and 10 months in prison. The language the judge used in his sentencing remarks reflected how seriously the court weighed what had happened, treating it as categorically distinct from the gang violence that had defined Mercanti's public reputation up to that point. Judge Stone characterized Mercanti as a man who had exerted dominance and control, specifically through violence, threats, and deliberate degradation. Language that framed the case not as an isolated series of assaults, but as a sustained, calculated pattern of coercive control extending across the entire 15-year relationship. The judge found Mercanti had shown no genuine remorse. He specifically expressed concern on the record that even a formal restraining order might prove insufficient to actually protect Kingdom going forward. An unusually direct acknowledgement from a sentencing judge that the legal system's standard protective mechanisms might not be adequate to the specific danger this particular offender represented. And then, in coverage of the case, Judge Stone was reported to have used a single word to describe Mercanti in his sentencing remarks. A word that landed in sharp, deliberate contrast to the fearsome, dangerous reputation Mercanti had spent nearly a decade cultivating. Not dangerous, not violent, Not a criminal, a coward. A man who had survived a basement stabbing and shooting, who had firebombed a rival clubhouse, who had defied a federal examiner rather than speak under oath, called a coward by a judge because of what he had done behind closed doors to the mother of his own children. That distinction matters more than anything else in this entire story. Mercanti walked free in January 2019 after nearly 7 years. Strict conditions attached: no alcohol, no licensed venues, no contact with outlaw motorcycle club members, no contact with Kingdom in any form. He reportedly joined the Mongols' Western Australian chapter upon his release, the organisation his former Finks chapter had been absorbed into while he was inside. In February 2020, barely a year after his release, police arrested 7 people in a major coordinated Mongols operation. Mercanti was among those detained for breaching his post-sentence supervision order by associating with fellow bikies. By 2023, he had accumulated 9 separate breach findings, earning a $9,000 fine. He became the first person formally charged under Western Australia's new anti-consorting legislation. He appeared in court wearing a shirt mocking the Attorney General, and in 2024, a woman came forward with serious sexual assault allegations against him. According to reporting, she withdrew her complaint citing fear for her own safety, specifically pointing to perceived threats from people associated with Mercanti. The charges were dropped, and in a detail that drew significant criticism from women's advocacy organizations, Mercanti received $1,500 toward his legal expenses following the collapse of the case. A woman who had come forward with a serious allegation withdrew because she feared retaliation, and the system, in processing that collapse, compensated the accused. At 58 years old, Mercanti flew to Bangkok. Western Australia's combat sports regulators had refused him a license, citing his criminal history. He trained intensively. He stepped into a professional boxing ring for the first time in his life. He knocked out his Thai opponent in 23 seconds. The headlines called it remarkable. A comeback, a second act. Nobody asked the question that matters most. What do his 2 sons, the boys who grew up in that house, think when they see their father's name in those headlines now? Here is what every Troy Mercanti headline gets wrong. They start with him. The basement shooting, the firebombing, the Bangkok knockout, the fearsome reputation, the coward's sentence. They let him be the center of gravity, the way men like him always become the center of gravity, and everything else orbits around that. But this story was not made by Troy Mercanti. It was made by 2 women. Tammy Kingdom, who spent 15 years inside a relationship she described under oath as defined by control, intimidation, and escalating violence, and who stood in a Perth courtroom and described in specific painful detail exactly what had been done to her, against a man whose reputation for violence had already kept an entire outlaw motorcycle club silent for years. And Mercanti's mother, whose name has never appeared in a single headline about this case, who sat in that same courtroom and confirmed what her daughter-in-law was saying was true, because she had seen it herself. Whatever ambiguity surrounds the rest of Troy Mercanti's criminal history, the acquittals, the withdrawn charges, the allegations that never reached a verdict, there is none here. He pleaded guilty in open court. His own mother confirmed it under oath, and a judge called him, in a word, a coward. The conviction exists specifically because 2 women refused to stay silent, and that is the part of this story worth carrying forward. Not the 23-second knockout in Bangkok, not the firebombing, not the basement shooting, the part where a mother looked across a courtroom at her own son and chose truth. There is one question this story leaves that nobody has answered publicly. Mercanti's mother made the choice she made in February 2013. We do not know what it cost her. We do not know what happened to that relationship afterwards. We do not know whether they have spoken since. What we do know is that she was given a choice that most people will never face, and she made the hardest one available to her. For our community here in Aotearoa, the lesson is not complicated. Sustained domestic violence does not announce itself. It builds slowly, behind closed doors, inside families, in spaces where the people closest to it have every reason to stay quiet. The women who speak, and the people around them who choose to confirm what they have seen, are the only reason any of it ever reaches a courtroom at all. What do you reckon? What does it take for someone to do what Mercanti's mother did? And are we doing enough to make sure the people who do speak feel safe enough to keep speaking?